Flowey Is Not a Good Life Coach by unrestedjade. Chapter 11. Things Can Always Get Worse. In the gloom of waterfall, Papyrus almost could have mistaken the plant on the margins of the shallow pond in this cavern for an echo flower. Perhaps other monsters had done just that, or whispered something to it, some small, sacred thought shared with the last creature in underground that should have such a thing. Papyrus made a quick check of the cavern. No one was around, for the moment. "What do you want?" Flowey smiled up at him. "What do you want?" The ferry was only a few hundred yards away. Papyrus could hear the gurgle of the river up ahead. "Don't waste my time," he said. "Don't waste my time?" "I'm not in the mood for your stupid nonsense tonight," Papyrus snapped, and kept walking, until a vine caught him around the ankle and nearly tripped him.
"I'm not in the mood for your stupid nonsense tonight."
Papyrus stood still, counting the luminescent fungi on the ground in front of him. He didn't want to turn around, so he wouldn't unless Flowey made him. "So I was thinking," Flowey said. The vine around Papyrus's ankle flexed, creaking against the leather of his boot. "We had to cut our practice short the other night, and you weren't really at 100% anyway, were you?" Papyrus didn't know if that called for an answer, so he didn't say anything. "No, you weren't. Silly of me to think you'd be in fighting shape after such a hectic day." Flowey hummed to himself for a moment. But you seem to be feeling better now, right? So we can make up our practice tonight, yes?" It wasn't a question. Papyrus nodded, gritting his teeth so hard he couldn't talk if he tried. "Good. Remember," Flowey said, "it'll be at our new spot at the usual time. We're going to try something new, and then I'm going to share you that important thing I told you about. Sound good?" Papyrus nodded. He'd agree to anything if Flowey would just leave. The vine unwound itself from his ankle. Papyrus didn't need to turn around to know Flowey had gone. He could tell from the sound. He didn't linger. If he hurried home, he could have just a few hours of normal life tonight. He wasn't looking forward to it as much anymore. Leftovers, lumpy couch, the flicker of the TV, all the ingredients were there, but Papyrus couldn't recapture that same feeling of serenity from before. He blamed Flowey's interruption and the imposition of another practice so soon after the last one, but truthfully he didn't know if that had made the difference. That peaceful evening that already felt a lifetime away may well have been a one-off, or maybe he was just trying too hard. It was hard to say. Papyrus shoved pasta around with his fork. Normally, he insisted on eating at the table from actual dishes, but that kind of thing didn't feel terribly important anymore. So here they were, eating straight from the storage containers like barbarians. Not that either of them were doing that much eating. "You okay over there, bro?" Papyrus looked up to find Sans studying him from the other end of the couch. "Fine," he said. Sans waggled his own container. "I can get you a plate if it's bothering you that much." "It doesn't matter." Papyrus chewed listlessly. This batch of spaghetti hadn't been one of his better attempts to start with, and he didn't have much of an appetite regardless. "Why do you think they replay these quiz shows?" he said, directing the conversation away from himself. "Everyone knows the answers now." Sans blinked. "You seriously remember all the answers?" "We saw this just 2 months ago," Papyrus said, shrugging. Most of the questions weren't that difficult to begin with. The one with 2 trains was just arithmetic, and since it was all multiple choice, there wasn't any need to get the exact answer. "Fair enough." The conversation fizzled out again. Anticipation hung in thick sheets in the air. Papyrus profoundly did not want to leave the house again tonight. Whatever new thing Flowey wanted to try, Papyrus was sure he wouldn't like it, and any news was probably bad. He never looked forward to these practices, but the threat of something unfamiliar had him actively dreading this one. No matter how badly he wanted time to stop and let him stay in this mediocre hour forever, the clock kept right on ticking. At last, he couldn't put off getting ready anymore. Sans watched him, playing with the drawstrings of his jacket in poorly hidden and increasing agitation. Bro? So, I was thinking..." Papyrus looked up from the straps he was fastening. He'd gotten the hang of buckling on even the tricky pieces of his armor, and it didn't take him even half the time it had taken the first time he'd kitted up. It was no more comfortable than before, but he was used to it now. Yes, he prompted, when Sans didn't go on. Well, you know how you're always complaining that I'm lazy and out of shape, and how I'd probably die if an icicle fell off the roof and hit me? It had been weeks and weeks since Papyrus had made any real mention of Sans's fitness, or lack thereof. They both knew that, and one of them thought they knew why, so Papyrus didn't dispute it. And? Sans shoved his hands into his pockets, drawing himself into less of a slouch. I figured maybe it's time to do something about that, so I'm gonna tag along with you. Absolutely not. Of course, Sans would choose now to give a damn about his health. But then this likely wasn't anything to do with Sans finally deciding to start training. Any other time, Papyrus would be more than happy to work with him, whatever his brother's motivation really was. Sans was incredibly frail. It had always been a source of anxiety for Papyrus. How easily he tired, how easily he could get hurt. And maybe the exercise would do him some good in other ways, make him feel a little better. But not now. Now, Sans needed to stay in the house where he was safe. It wasn't really a question, Sans said. His grin slipped. You're not even on patrol tonight, so what's the problem? Papyrus glowered and pointedly went back to fastening the last of the plates. I'd really rather you didn't, Sans. Sans's face fell into an outright frown. Yeah, well, he said. Guess who has two thumbs and doesn't care what you'd rather? You can't keep me from going unless you stay in, so deal with it. For just a flash, Papyrus's mind went totally blank with rage. He'd never been so mad at Sans in his life. Briefly, he considered some way he could really keep Sans from following him. But no. Locking his brother in the shed was something there was no coming back from. There was no way to justify it or explain it without putting Sans in more danger, so he'd just have to come up with something else. He was going to be late for practice. He'd just have to hope that Flowey wouldn't come looking for him. Fine, Papyrus said, jabbing a finger in Sans's direction. But I'm not going easy on you. It's not my problem if you can't keep up. Sans shrugged. Hey, don't write me off just yet. I might surprise you. His grin crept back into place, but it fell a little flat. Anger whiplashed hard into guilt. Sans was just lonely and worried. Papyrus had no call to be so sharp with him. And hadn't Papyrus decided just today he was going to make more of an effort to support his brother? God, but he couldn't have had worse timing. Papyrus locked the door behind them and kept quiet as they walked down the road that led past the library. Most everyone was indoors at this time of night, and a fresh snow was filling in the myriad tracks and footprints that crisscrossed the town, giving the ground a softer look. Papyrus liked it when it was snowing. He liked the clean white blanket it created over everything, the almost nothing whisper of sound it made as it was falling. He liked how it muffled the world for a little while. He sighed. Snow or not, this was shaping up to be a bad night. It just went to show that things could always get worse. Do you remember how to get to that hill? He said, breaking the silence once they were on the edge of town. Yeah, Sans said. I think so. Papyrus picked up the pace. Good. For a warm-up, he said. We're going to run there, okay? Sans blanched. What, all the way? If you can't keep up, then go home. This would be unpleasant in a full suit of armor, but Papyrus could do it. He started running. Cursing, Sans ran too. His form was atrocious. He put in the effort, though, doing his best to keep up even though he had to take 2 steps to Papyrus's 1. It remained to be seen whether he could last the 2 miles to the hill. Papyrus, for his part, didn't really want to see that. After the first quarter mile, he sped up. His longer stride ate up the distance, and it wasn't long before he'd built up a significant lead. The armor weighed on him, but however hard he had to work to keep up his pace, Sans had to work even harder to not be left behind entirely. Papyrus could hear faint, breathless grumbling behind him, receding slowly but surely. He slowed just a bit. He didn't want to get out of sight, or Sans might be tempted to slow into an easier jog. The trees grew thicker, crowded closer together as they retreated farther into the forest. Papyrus picked his way through the worst of it, leading his brother up every incline, through every snowdrift, and over every fallen log he could manage. He would let Sans nearly catch up, only to leave him in the dust again, carefully pacing his brother to ensure that he was as worn out and frustrated as possible when they reached the top of the hill. With any luck, Sans would throw in the towel at that point and head for home. When Sans did crest the top of the hill, wheezing and shaking, Papyrus was waiting for him. There you are, Papyrus glared, hands on hips and fighting the urge to run over to make sure Sans was okay. "What took you so long? I've been waiting here for ages."
"No fair," Sans rasped. "Your legs are like twice as long as mine."
Papyrus scoffed. "And I'm carrying what amounts to 3 of you on my back. It took you over 40 minutes to run 2 miles, Sans. That's absolutely dreadful." He was actually a little impressed that Sans had made it all the way here without stopping. Not that he was going to come out and say it. Sans coasted to a halt at Papyrus's side and sort of gently keeled over into the snow.
"A personal best," he said,
quelling Papyrus's brief panic at his collapse.
"Think I'm gonna take a little break now."
A break was not what needed to happen. Papyrus couldn't let up until Sans gave in and left. "Oh, no you don't, lazy bones." Papyrus nudged Sans with his boot. "Up!" Sans half-heartedly pitched a handful of snow at him.
"I'm dying, bro. Snow me a little mercy, huh?"
"A feeble attempt, just like you're running." Papyrus felt like a cad, but this was necessary for Sans's own safety. "Get up. The night's half over already."
"I got a stitch in my side."
"We barely even have sides, Sans," Papyrus said, rolling his eyes.
"Then it's a miracle. The angel's coming to take me away."
Sans drew the back of his hand over his brow in a mock swoon.
"So long, dear brother. Settle my tab with Grilby when I'm gone."
"Sans, stop wasting time." This was taking too long. Papyrus scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. The longer they were in the forest, the more likely something bad was going to happen. He desperately hoped that Flowey was still in the new clearing. Sans grumbled, but pushed himself to his feet. He was clearly worn out.
"Fine, I'm up," he said,
visible tremors running through his arms and legs.
"What's next, Sarge?"
Papyrus paused. "When was the last time you used your magic?" Sans did a few calculations on his fingers. He shrugged.
"Couldn't say."
Of course. Sans was the more gifted of the two when it came to magical ability. Maybe that was part of the reason why he didn't make any effort to improve. It was only part of the reason, and possibly only a small part, but Papyrus didn't have the luxury of being able to look after his brother's feelings tonight. Right now, he needed to get Sans to admit defeat without actually hurting him. Given the shape he was in, that could pose a challenge. "Start with something basic, then." Face screwed up in concentration, Sans raised one hand and tossed out a small arc of bones. They skipped over the surface of the snow in a widening cone and faded away. He turned to Papyrus with a sheepish grin.
"Well," he said, "that kinda sucked, huh?"
It did suck. That's why you ought to be practicing. His current predicament aside, Papyrus shuddered to think what would happen if Sans somehow ended up in a fight. "Do it again." The next arc moved a little faster, lasted a little longer. "Instead of a single arc," Papyrus said, "do a wave." Sans sent out a wave. It marched along the ground at uniform speed, each bone uniformly shaped and spaced. Not very effective as an attack, but neatly formed. Papyrus judged it safe to push a bit more, now that Sans had proven he still remembered how to cast. "Try an interlocking wave," he said. It was an attack they both favored. Sans called it high-stakes double dutch. Papyrus didn't care for the name, but he had to admit it described how an opponent looked while they were trying to dodge the attack pretty accurately. The waves passed through each other with mathematical precision. Keeping his attention spread over a larger area than the linear attacks he'd been using would tire Sans out more quickly, so Papyrus drilled him on every variation of the attack he could think of. He had Sans vary the height of the bones, the speed and waves of their duration, the addition of blue attacks, and secondary layers. After half an hour, Papyrus started to get irritated. Sans's endurance was at the same time worse than he'd feared and better than he'd hoped. He was tired, but he cheerfully kept going, defying Papyrus's expectations. "Your attacks are too regular," Papyrus chided. "Too easy to dodge." He was running out of ideas. Sans couldn't possibly be enjoying himself. What was it going to take to get him to quit? Oh, whatever. If Sans wouldn't leave, then he might as well address one of his actual weaknesses. If Sans wouldn't leave, there was a chance those weaknesses might become a more immediate problem. Papyrus's checks of the forest around them were bordering on a compulsion. It was getting late. His magic itched across his palms, restless. Sans peered up at him. "Is Mr. Gentleman Duelist seriously telling me to fight dirty?" His voice was unsteady and thin, betraying the toll the drills were taking on him even if his performance hadn't suffered yet. "I'm not saying anything like that. Just..." Papyrus fumbled. His philosophy on fighting had shifted, and he hadn't been aware of that until the moment he'd put it into words. He laid his hand on his brother's shoulder. Under the jacket, the bones felt light, hollow. "If this really happens, you need to win," he said, at last. Sans couldn't take a fraction of the punishment Papyrus could, not as he was now. His magic was his only defense, and he'd let even that slide.
"Wow, okay.
Sans mumbled, rocking on his heels for a moment.
Who are you, and what did you do with Papyrus?"
Papyrus glared. "Sans, I'm being serious." Brushing Papyrus's hand aside, Sans took half a step back. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets.
"Yeah, bro, I know," he said.
Something dark passed over his features and was gone, too fast and subtle to parse.
"Maybe I need a demo? You know me," he chuckled. "Slow learner."
Papyrus looked away, opening and closing his fists. His hands felt strangely empty. "That's not going to be happening."
"Come on, bro,"
Sans said, shifting his weight into a slightly more confrontational slouch.
"You haven't done a damn thing but bark orders at me since we got here."
"That's not my fault." Papyrus crossed his arms. "Maybe if you'd given me some time to prepare, instead of just inviting yourself along..."
"Do you want me around or not?"
Papyrus's jaw snapped shut in mid-sentence. He blinked.
"Because I'm getting confused," Sans went on, glaring down at the churned-up ground.
The fresh snow was filling in and evening out the dips and gouges. It would be treacherous to walk on.
"I mean," he shrugged, "I haven't been pushy, have I? You don't want to talk about it, so we don't talk about it. You're scaring me, but I'm leaving it alone because that's what you want me to do. And you've been tolerating me for these last few days since that thing, so I thought maybe things were getting better, a little."
Sans.
"And I don't know what I expected tonight. I just thought, I don't know, you spend all this time alone out here, and you're always nagging me about this stuff, and it could have been..."
He gestured vaguely with one hand. He was angry, his words clipped and his voice creeping higher.
"It could have been fun or something, like that day last week, like before. I just thought maybe we could help each other out, like we always do. All you've been trying to do this whole time is get me to give up and leave."
Papyrus felt about an inch tall. "This just isn't a good time, that's all," he said. He checked the trees again, unable to meet Sans' eyes. The itching was getting worse. The forest was quiet, and Sans was raising his voice, and he felt so very, very exposed up here.
"Oh, sure, it's not a good time."
Papyrus could practically hear Sans' eyes rolling.
"I swear to God, it's like you're a different person, and I don't even know why. I'm so tired of this."
"Leave, then!" Papyrus tried for sternness, but his voice cracked. He moved across his arms again and ended up sort of hugging himself instead, trying to comfort himself, or trying to hold something in, or both. His brother stood up straight.
"Excuse me?"
Oh, Sans was pissed. No mistake. "If I'm upsetting you so much, then leave," Papyrus repeated, with a little more feeling. "I wanted to be by myself, so go away." He hated that he had to do this, but he was over an hour late already, and he was getting twitchy, and he felt weird, and that couldn't be good. Sans glared, face pinched and shrinking in on himself.
"You've got to be kidding me."
Papyrus took a deep breath. He could do this. It was for Sans' own good. He wasn't safe here. "No," he said. "You're the allegedly funny one, not me. I don't know what makes you think you'll do me any good when you can't even handle yourself. Go back to town, Sans." He looked down his nasal bone at Sans. It was easy to pull off a haughty look, given the height advantage. "I don't want you here. I can't use any smaller words than that." Sans flinched like he'd been hit. He recovered quickly, though, darting to stand toe-to-toe with Papyrus.
"You know what?"
he said, voice quavering and tears gathering at the corners of his eye sockets.
"Fuck you, Papyrus. You don't see me treating you like garbage just because I had a bad day. Which is every goddamn day, by the way."
His finger prodded Papyrus's breastplate with a hard tick.
"I'm done. So you better tell me what the hell your problem is right fucking now.
Magic shivered up Papyrus's spine, tickled the roof of his mouth. He was angry and scared, and starting to panic. This was turning bad. He felt wrong. I don't have to tell you anything, he hissed, desperate. Go away! Make me! Sans shoved him, putting all of his weight behind it. Reflexively, Papyrus swung, backhanding Sans to the ground. Both brothers froze, shocked. Sans moved first, bringing his hands up to shield himself.
Whoa.
He wasn't looking at Papyrus. His fearful stare was fixed on a point just above Papyrus's head. Papyrus felt the flow of magic and realized what his brother was staring at. No, no, no! Spent magic fell around him like snow as Papyrus frantically tore down whatever had formed when he lashed out. Slowly, like he was facing down a dangerous animal, Sans stumbled to his feet. His outstretched hand could have been beckoning Papyrus closer or holding him back at bay. It was impossible to tell. Bro? The single syllable punched through the shock, letting panic take hold in earnest. Get away from me! Papyrus's first impulse was to put his brother on the ground again. He knew Sans couldn't, would never hurt him, but that one hard push had been enough to set off this, and he didn't understand. He turned and sprinted down the far side of the hill. He had to get away. His magic swamped him, choking him, and he forced it down. Down, 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 and it was going to escape, and he couldn't keep it under. He was going to go off, and they were miles from town, and Sans was so fragile. Why was this happening? Papyrus heard footsteps following him, heard Sans calling to him. He couldn't make out the words. All his higher functions had been washed out with dumb primal terror. Get away! Hold it down! Hold it in! Get away! Far away! He was faster. He could lose him. Get to the trees. Hold it down. Down, down, down! Keep running! Icy blue filled his vision. He stumbled over his own momentum, tried to stop it or change direction, and wound up slamming into the fence of bones Sans had raised in front of him. Electric cold zapped through him, blue-white pain. It flipped the switch on his fight-or-flight response, and his magic ripped free, unspooling in every direction, all out of control. Distantly, separated by space or the drug haze of absolute fear, Papyrus could hear Sans shouting. Weight that wasn't weight pulled him down, hard enough to knock the wind out of him if he'd had lungs. He clawed at the ground, leaving furrows in the snow, every movement a monumental effort. The surface of his bones prickled with a familiar sensation of blue. Sans was very good at blue, Papyrus recalled, dimly through his panic. He didn't even need an attack as a vector. Papyrus tried to grasp at his magic, to reel it back in. Half-formed waves snaked along the ground and lashed the air, directionless and knife-sharp, seeking something, anything alive to target. Ethereal fire wreathed in his hands and licked up his arms, arsenic blue and painfully bright. He couldn't hold it. Sans ran, half-tripping down the hillside. Oh, fuck! He chanted the phrase like a spell. Oh, fuck! Oh, fuck! God damn it! Stay back! Papyrus shouted, voice hoarse and weak. His attacks bled his strength away with no way to cut them off. He thrashed against the force pulling him down. He needed to get farther away from Sans. Sans simply pressed harder, pinning him flat against the ground. Steel groaned ominously around him, and Papyrus wondered exactly how ironic it would be to be crushed by his own armor. Beyond the blinding, chaotic light of his own magic, Papyrus could make out the single lantern glow of Sans's magic, contained and controlled as it should be. Sans jiggled anxiously at the edge of Papyrus's range, wanting to get closer but not daring to put himself in the path of a stray attack. Thankfully, Sans's range was slightly larger, but neither of them knew precisely by how much. Back up! An arc of partially congealed bones collapsed into magical noise mere yards away from where Sans was standing. Sorry, can't do that! Sans called, voice strained. He must have been holding Papyrus at the edge of his own range. You just run off again! He paced back and forth, just out of reach of the attacks breaking like surf in front of him. Bro, you gotta relax! Try to breathe or something! Breathing was easier said than done. Had Papyrus been the type of monster that needed air, he'd have been in serious trouble by now. Sans was pressing hard enough that he could feel his long bones bend slightly when he tried to raise his limbs, and his rib cage was compressed to the point of pain. The ache gave his pain focus, a pivot point, and he tried to ground himself to it. With considerable effort, he could take very shallow breaths. He concentrated on that, trying to ignore the maelstrom in favor of listening to the soft creak of his ribs. In and hold. Out and hold. Over and over. Over and over. He didn't count his breaths, didn't know how long he waited, crushed down into the snow while his magic raged around him. In the end, he couldn't tell if he'd successfully calmed down, or if he'd simply burned through all available fuel. He didn't know when Sans had approached him, but when he felt his brother's hand on his arm, his flinch was only a flinch. Nothing else.
Easy, easy. I got you, Papyrus.
Sans leaned over so Papyrus could see him. He looked exhausted, and tear tracks stained his face.
You okay now?
Papyrus croaked a laugh. Okay? How?
If I let go, are you gonna dust me?
Sans knelt down next to him. No, Papyrus said, after some thought. After more thought, he added, Don't think so.
I guess that's good enough,
Sans said, and the weight that wasn't weight disappeared. Papyrus curled up on himself as much as his armor would allow. He thought he ought to be crying, or something, but then that would require energy, and he was utterly spent. I'm sorry. He hoped Sans could hear him. Anything over a whisper was just too much effort.
No, Sans sighed. This was my fault. It was a dumb idea.
He brushed his fingertips over the side of Papyrus's face, sighing again when Papyrus cringed at the unexpected sting.
Man, you got pretty scuffed up. Sorry, he said. I was sure you'd stop in time.
The bones, right. Papyrus reached up with a hand that felt oddly light now and touched his face, wincing. Rough, pitted abrasions traced from brow to halfway down his jaw on the left side of his face. It felt like he probably had matching abrasions running all the way down that side of his body, too. He hadn't been hit with the business end of a blue attack in years. He'd forgotten how much they hurt. It's okay, he said. The sting would fade. He'd had worse. You were trying to help. Sans leaned against him, likely too tired to hold himself up anymore.
Yeah, I made you have a nervous breakdown, and then I jacked up your face. Super helpful. Go me.
Papyrus moved to do something soothing. He wasn't in a state to plan things out. Whatever he intended to do, he misjudged how hard it would be to move his arm, and ended up boffing Sans in the side of the head. Sorry, he said, and patted Sans clumsily, square in the face. He let his arm drop back down. Moving was clearly not worth it right now. Didn't want to hurt you. One solid hit. That's all it would have taken. No possibility of rescue, nothing left to heal. He shivered. You didn't, Sans said. They sat in silence for several minutes, quietly horrified and so tired. Papyrus watched the snow fall. It was coming down heavier now, big and fluffy. Perfect for snowballs. He remembered something. Every day, he said, and coughed to clear some of the scratchiness from his voice. Every day is bad?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Sans put his hood up, tugging it down to keep the snowflakes out of his eye sockets.
It's not because of you. I mean, he said, that's not really helping, but like you said, you're allowed to have problems too.
He leaned back, laying his head against Papyrus's breastplate with a hollow clack.
Don't suppose you want to tell me what those are now?
Papyrus shifted his arm out of the way. From this angle, he could see up under the hood to meet Sans's eyes. Why is every day bad? He countered. Why did you stop trying? Sans sighed, scowling up at the hill.
I'll tell, he said, if you do.
His gaze returned to Papyrus, and Papyrus had to look away.
Yeah, Sans said. I figured.
Papyrus scrubbed at his eye sockets. There were those tears. Better late than never. Great. Sorry, he said, for what felt like the 1,000th time. I want to. Sans sighed, for what also felt like the 1,000th time.
Then why don't you?
I just can't. No matter what. They fell silent again for a while.
God.
Papyrus started, spooked out of the light doze he'd slipped into. He looked up at Sans, questioning.
All that, Sans said, that telltale quaver back in his voice. After all that, we're just gonna sit here and cry ourselves to sleep in the snow, in the middle of the goddamn forest, because we won't talk.
Papyrus made a wordless sound of agreement. Gingerly, he pushed himself up to his knees, catching Sans when the movement jostled him. They both took a moment to wipe their faces dry, studiously not looking at each other. Sans stood first and offered his hand to help Papyrus up. Papyrus took it, careful to not actually pull at all. He was tempted just to get rid of the armor, it was so blasted heavy. But it was expensive, he knew, and it would rust in the snow even if he came back for it tomorrow. So he stood, shaking under the weight. They skirted around the hill, picking their way through the drifts because it was still easier than climbing, until they got back to the path they'd taken. Papyrus watched Sans weave along, half drunk with exhaustion. "I can carry you if you want," he said. Sans shot him a skeptical look.
"No, you can't,"
he said, turning his attention back to make sure the ground was where he thought it was.
"I'm good to walk."
They didn't say anything else after that. The walk back to the house was interminable. Snowdon, when they reached it, was asleep and silent, dreamlike. Their front door took an eon of fumbling with keys and shaky hands. The TV was still on, too much work to turn it off. Papyrus shucked off every plate of armor he could lose without stopping, letting each piece thud to the floor, a trail of cold and heavy steel. The stairs were endless, but to hell and back with that couch. His bed was neatly made, and it was too much work to turn down the covers, so he just let himself fall onto it. He felt the mattress dip, felt Sans press against him, back to back, felt the hitching of his brother's shoulders, caught the barely audible sobbing he tried to muffle with his jacket sleeves. Papyrus had no more tears to cry. He was numb. He was grateful. Dawn wasn't far off. There would be consequences, he knew. Later, he would be frightened. Later, there would be apologies, and begging, and fear, and pain. But right now, he didn't care. He didn't care about anything.